Have you ever noticed that some people seem to love you intensely until the moment you change a little? This change can be small. A day when you're quieter, a moment when you don't have the energy to cheer anyone up, a phase when you simply can't be the lighthearted, interesting, or available person you've always been. And then, suddenly, something changes in the other person's gaze. It's not immediate, but it's noticeable. Attention wanes. Interest weakens. The connection seems to lose strength, as if something invisible has been broken. Now think about it calmly. What exactly changed there? Was it you? Or was it the feeling you used to evoke? This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about human relationships. We grow up believing that we are loved for who we are, that there is something essential in us that generates true connection, something unique, profound, almost untouchable. But in practice, what sustains most relationships is not someone's essence. It's the emotional experience that this person delivers. Observe any relationship around you. Friendships, romances, even family relationships. There's always an invisible pattern, an emotional dynamic that repeats itself. There is someone who always listens, someone who always cheers people up, someone who always gets things done, someone who always validates. And as long as this pattern holds, everything seems to work. But what happens when this pattern fails? Imagine someone who has always been lighthearted, funny, and pleasant. This person enters any room and improves the atmosphere. They make others laugh, feel good, and relax. Now imagine that, for some reason, she stops doing that. Maybe she's tired. Maybe she's going through something difficult. Maybe she just wants to be quiet. The reaction around us changes. People start to find it strange. Some distance themselves. Others lose interest. And often, that person doesn't understand what happened. Because, in her mind, she remains the same. But for the others, something essential has disappeared. This reveals a deeper layer of reality. Many connections are not with who you are, but with the effect you have. And this is not necessarily conscious. No one wakes up thinking, I'm going to like this person just because of how they make me feel. But that's how the human brain works. He seeks pleasure, relief, validation, and security. And anything that provides those sensations automatically becomes valuable. Now, comes a question that few people have the courage to face. If you stopped generating those feelings, would you still be important to the same people? Think about times when you weren't feeling well. Moments when you didn't have the energy to be present, interesting, or understanding. How many people truly stayed close without demanding that you revert to your role? This question is unsettling because it disrupts a comfortable narrative. The idea that there is a pure love, one that sees you completely, regardless of what you give. This type of connection exists, but it's rare, much rarer than most people would like to admit. The most common scenario is something more subtle, almost imperceptible. People connect with what you represent emotionally. If you project a sense of security, you attract those who seek security. If you inspire admiration, you attract those who need to feel validated. If you radiate lightness, you attract those who want to escape their own inner burden. And without realizing it, you begin to occupy a place in these people's lives. A place that isn't exactly you. It's a function. And as long as you perform that role well, everything seems to make sense. But there is an important detail. Functions can be replaced. And that explains why some relationships end in such a messy way. There wasn't a big fight. There wasn't a specific event, just a gradual change. The intensity decreased. The closeness disappeared. And when you realize it, that connection that seemed strong no longer exists, like something that evaporates. And at that moment, most people enter into an internal conflict. They begin to wonder what they did wrong, if they said something inappropriate, if they acted differently, if they lost some kind of value. But often the answer is both simpler and harder to accept at the same time. They simply stopped generating the same feeling, and that's enough to make the interest disappear. Now, consider the impact this has on how you live. If, ultimately, connections depend on how you make others feel, then there is a constant, invisible pressure, a need to maintain this effect, to continue being interesting, to continue being emotionally useful, to continue being desired. And this may seem subtle at first, but over time, it becomes a pattern. You start to adjust, avoid behaviors that could break the way others perceive you, hiding parts of oneself that don't generate a positive response. And without realizing it, you begin to negotiate who you are in order to maintain how you are perceived. Now, think about it honestly. How many times have you done this? How many times have you refrained from saying something, acting in a certain way, or even showing a side of yourself, just to avoid changing someone's reaction? This is the point where the dynamic ceases to be natural and begins to become strategic. And from there, a silent risk arises. You can be valued for a long time without ever being truly known, because people continue to react to what you deliver, not to who you are. And that creates a strange feeling. You are surrounded by people, but at the same time, there is a part of you that is not seen, a party that is not involved in the relationship, and at some point, that starts to weigh on you, because maintaining a feeling requires effort, and this effort is not always recognized. Now, go back to the beginning, that subtle change that made someone distance themselves. Perhaps it wasn't a mistake. Perhaps it was simply the first time you stopped sustaining an emotional experience that person expected. And this leads to an inevitable reflection. If people stay because of how you make them feel, then what happens when you start showing who you really are, without adjusting, without softening, without playing any role? There is something even deeper happening behind all of this. Something that most people never realize, because it happens outside of their conscious awareness. When someone connects with you, the connection is rarely based solely on what's visible. It's not just about what you say, how you act, or how you present yourself. It's about what you represent in that person's mind. Carl Jung explained that a large part of our relationships happens through projections. This means that when looking at you, the other person is not only seeing who you truly are, they are seeing an image constructed from their own needs, desires, and past experiences. In other words, she is completing you with parts of herself. Imagine a man who grew up feeling a lack of recognition. He never felt good enough, never felt validated. When he meets someone who shows admiration, who listens attentively, who values what he says, something very powerful happens inside him. He doesn't just like that person. He is finally feeling something he has spent his entire life searching for. And at that moment, you cease to be just you. You become the validation he never had. Now, consider another situation. A woman who has been through unstable relationships, always afraid of abandonment. When she finds someone who conveys security, presence, and stability, the connection feels intense, almost immediate. But again, it's not just about the person. It's about what she activates internally. She begins to associate you with the sense of security that was missing in her life. And that's why connections often seem so quick and so deep right from the start. Because it's not a meeting between two complete people. It's a meeting of emotional needs. Now, there's an important detail that almost no one notices. These projections create a version of you that isn't real, an idealized version. And this version begins to guide the entire relationship. The other person begins to interact with that image, and not with who you really are. At first, this may seem positive. You are seen as someone special, different, almost perfect within that context. But there is an unavoidable problem. You can't sustain a version of yourself that isn't entirely you for very long. And gradually, small inconsistencies begin to appear. You don't react exactly as the other person expected. You don't always maintain the same level of attention. You show sides that weren't in the image she created. And it is at this point that something begins to break. But this breakdown doesn't happen in a clear way. It happens subtly. The other person begins to feel that something has changed, even if they don't know exactly what. Interest wanes somewhat. The excitement isn't the same anymore. The connection loses intensity, and often this leads to strange behavior. The person starts trying to correct you. She makes subtle comments, She expects certain behaviors. She reacts negatively when you deviate from the pattern she imagined. Not because you did something wrong, but that's because you're not living up to the image she's built. Now think about everyday life. Think about how many times you felt you needed to act a certain way to maintain a relationship, respond in a specific way, show interest at a precise level, avoid certain behaviors that could cause discomfort. This doesn't happen by chance. This happens because, even without realizing it, you are being molded into an expectation, and in many cases, you do the same to others as well. Have you ever met someone within a few days, formed an idea of voice? Have you ever imagined how she should act, what she should feel, how she should treat you? And when she didn't reciprocate, did you feel a kind of frustration, even without a concrete reason? This is how the mechanism works. Projection isn't something only others do to you. It's something everyone does all the time. Now, here's the trickiest part. The stronger someone's emotional need, the more intense the projection. And the more intense the projection, the more unstable the connection. Because it's not based on reality, it is based on expectation, and expectations are fragile. They depend on consistent performance. They demand that you remain exactly what you were designed to be. But that's impossible. You change. You fluctuate. You have good days and bad days. You are not a fixed feeling. And that's where the real conflict begins. The person begins to realize, even unconsciously, that you don't fully match what they imagined. And this creates an internal breakdown. But instead of acknowledging that the image was wrong, she begins to feel that the connection has changed, that you've changed. Something has been lost. And in many cases, the reaction is not understanding. It's a separation. Now, there is a question that may seem simple, but is deeply uncomfortable. How many people in your life truly know you without projections? No silent expectations? Without needing to be anything specific for the relationship to work? If you think about it carefully, you'll realize that this number is much smaller than it seems. And that doesn't mean people are fake. It means they are human. They connect through what they feel, and what they feel doesn't always have a direct relationship with reality. Now, imagine the impact this would have on a closer relationship, a romantic relationship. For example, at first, everything seems intense because the projections are strong. There is admiration, curiosity, and anticipation. But with time, reality begins to take over. And at that moment, two things can happen. Either the relationship adjusts to reality, or it starts to fall apart. And often, this process is silent. There is no clear conversation. There is no explicit reason. Just a feeling that something is no longer the same as before. And this leads many people to the wrong conclusion. They believe they have lost value. They've ceased to be interesting, which were not enough when, in fact, something else happened. The image that supported the connection no longer exists. And that completely changes the way you view relationships. Because it's not just about being better, more interesting, or more present. It's about understanding that, often, you've never been fully seen from the start. And this sets the stage for the next point, which is inevitable, the moment when the illusion ceases to hold up, and reality begins to emerge in a way that is impossible to ignore. There's a specific moment in almost every relationship that no one announces, no one names, but that completely changes everything that comes after. It's not a fight. It's not a serious mistake. It's not a conscious decision. It's a silent change. At first, everything seems easy. Conversations flow. Interest is constant. There's curiosity. There's presence. The other person responds quickly, shows attention, seems genuinely involved. But gradually, small variations begin to emerge. Response time increases. Enthusiasm decreases. Energy levels shift, and you feel it, even without proof, even without clear explanations. Something inside you senses that the dynamic is no longer the same. But here's the most important point. This change doesn't begin with visible behavior. It begins earlier, in a place you can't see. It begins the moment the image that the other person has created of you starts to crumble. Have you ever stop to think about the last time someone lost interest in you for no clear reason? Perhaps it was after you showed signs of tiredness, or after disagreeing with something, or simply by acting more naturally without trying to please. Small details, but enough to shatter expectations. And when expectations are shattered, perception changes. Now, think of a common situation. Two people begin to get to know each other. Initially, one of them shows constant attention, responds quickly, keeps the conversation active, and creates a sense of ongoing interest. The other person gets used to it. Without realizing it, she begins to associate that behavior with value. Now, imagine that, for whatever reason, this pattern changes. The person doesn't respond as frequently. He doesn't show the same level of enthusiasm. What happens? The feeling of connection diminishes, but not because the person became less interesting. Yes, because the emotional experience has changed. Now comes the question that almost no one asks. If the basis of the connection was behavior, was it really about you? This is the moment of rupture, and it doesn't just happen on one side. You often go through this too. Have you ever distanced yourself from someone and, when you tried to explain why, realized you didn't have a concrete reason? Nothing serious happened, but something seemed different. The person no longer generated the same feeling, and even without fully understanding, you began to distance yourself. This pattern repeats itself in countless relationships, and this reveals something unsettling. Human interest is extremely sensitive to changes in perception. There's no need for a mistake. Just one inconsistency is enough. Now, think about the impact of this over time. You enter a relationship being valued for certain behaviors, certain attitudes, a certain way of being present, and without realizing it, you start to maintain that. Not because she wants to pretend, but because he realizes that it works. It generates a response. It generates connection. It generates closeness. But there is a limit. No one can sustain an idealized version of themselves forever. And inevitably, you start to show parts that weren't present at the beginning. You look tired. Your mood changes. You stop responding at the same pace. You stop trying so hard, and that shouldn't be a problem. But within a dynamic based on sensation, that's enough to change everything. Now there is an internal breakdown in the other person, and this breakdown generates a conflict because, instead of realizing that the image was incomplete, she begins to feel that you have changed, and this leads to misinterpretations. You're not the same as you used to be. You've changed. You no longer show the same interest. But have you really changed, or have you just stopped holding on to an expectation? This difference completely changes how you understand relationships, because often you're not being rejected for who you are. You're being rejected because you failed to live up to a version of yourself that was never entirely true. Now let's go deeper. There is a psychological phenomenon known as emotional adaptation. This means that, over time, what once generated an intense response begins to become commonplace. What once seemed special is now expected. What once generated enthusiasm becomes normal. And this creates an implicit need to maintain or increase the level of stimulation. But is this sustainable? Can you consistently improve how you make someone feel? The answer is no. And that's why many relationships decline for no apparent reason. There was no mistake. There was an adaptation. And when adaptation occurs, the sensation diminishes. And when the feeling diminishes, interest begins to fluctuate. Now, think about how confusing that could be for someone. The person feels that the connection is weakening, but he doesn't understand why. And in an attempt to recover what existed before, she can do two things, or try to put in more effort, attempting to recreate the initial feeling, or they begin to distance themselves, believing that something has been irreversibly lost. None of these answers solves the real problem, because the problem isn't the intensity. It's at the heart of the connection. Now comes an important break from the norm. What if the relationship never had a sufficient foundation to support reality? What if everything that seemed strong at the beginning depended on a specific emotional state that couldn't last? This idea is difficult to accept because it contradicts how most people understand the beginning of relationships. They believe that intensity is a sign of depth, but often, intensity is merely a sign of projection, and projections don't stand the test of time. Now, think about how many times you've experienced something that started out very intense and ended without explanation. No fight, no clear reason. It just lost strength. This was not random. It was the natural cycle of a connection based on feeling. And this leads to an inevitable point. If most relationships go through this breakdown, then the real problem isn't the loss of connection. The problem lies in the fact that the connection was never built to last beyond the initial illusion. And this sets the stage for the next question, which is even more uncomfortable. If people connect with a feeling and withdraw when that feeling changes, then what role are you unknowingly playing within your own relationships? There comes a point when you stop being just yourself within a relationship and start taking on a role. And the most dangerous thing is that it happens without you realizing it. At first, everything seems natural. You act spontaneously, respond as you wish, show interest when you feel it, and withdraw when you need to. But, little by little, the relationship begins to teach you what works. You realize that when you act in a certain way, you receive more attention. When you respond quickly, the other person approaches. When you demonstrate lightness, everything flows better. And without realizing it, you start repeating this behavior, not as a conscious strategy, but as an adaptation. According to psychology, this type of dynamic is common because human beings organize themselves socially through patterns of behavior and emotional response. Interpersonal attraction, for example, depends heavily on how someone makes another person feel and the repetition of these positive experiences. Now, imagine this happening continuously. You begin to realize that being understanding creates closeness. So you become always understanding. You realize that being fun creates connection. So you always become fun. You realize that being available avoids conflict. So you become always available. And gradually, this ceases to be just a part of you. This becomes your role. But here's the point that changes everything. A role doesn't define who you are. It's a role you play in someone's life. And roles have expectations. Think of a simple story. This person has always been the emotional support for everyone around them. Friends, partner, family, always present, always available, always listening. Initially, this generates recognition. People value it. Closeness increases. But over time, this ceases to be valued and becomes expected. And on the day that person is unable to fulfill that role because they are tired, overwhelmed, or simply need space, the reaction is not one of understanding. It's strange. You're different. What happened to you? You're not the same as you used to be. But has it changed? Or has it simply stopped fulfilling a function? Now think about it honestly. How many times have you been put in a role like this? The fort. It solves it. The one complains. What he always understands. He who always gives more than he receives. As long as you maintain that, everything seems to work. But there's a detail that almost no one notices. The more you identify with that role, the harder it becomes to get out of it. There is even a concept in psychology called projective identification, where a person ends up being led to act according to what has been projected onto them, as if they were becoming the other person's own expectation. In other words, it's not just that they expect something from you. You start to become that, and this creates a silent trap, because at that point, the relationship no longer depends on who you are. It depends on your consistency in that role. Now, imagine the impact of this over time. You wake up tired, but you need to feel light. You're frustrated, but you need to be understanding. You want to distance yourself, but you need to be present. And, little by little, you begin to split apart. There's the version you feel, and the version you deliver. And the greater this difference, the greater the wear and tear. Now, here's an important break from the norm. What if the reason you feel drained in some relationships isn't a lack of energy, but is it excessive? Think about it. You're not just experiencing the relationship. You are sustaining a constant emotional experience for another person, and that requires effort, more effort than it seems. Now, there is another, even deeper point. People don't just expect you to keep up the role. They start to react when you leave him, and this can be subtle. A change in tone, a decrease in attention span, a colder response, or you could be more direct. Demands, criticism, distancing, but in both cases, the message is the same. Go back to being who you were to me. And this reveals something important about the nature of relationships. Many connections are not maintained by who you are. They are maintained by the predictability of the experience you deliver. Now, think about how much this can distort your own identity. If you spend enough time being valued only when you fulfill a role, you start to believe that this role is you, and that changes the way you see yourself. You no longer ask yourself, who am I? You start to wonder, what do they expect from me? And that's dangerous, because at that point, you can spend years being recognized without ever truly being seen. Now, observe something curious. Many people say they want someone for real, someone authentic, someone genuine, but in practice, when this authenticity emerges, it can cause discomfort because it breaks the expected pattern, and this creates a paradox. People say they want the truth, but they connect with emotional predictability. Now, the inevitable question, if you stop fulfilling your role, what's left of the relationship? This question is not theoretical. She is practical, and the answer to it defines everything that comes after. Because at some point, you're going to get tired. You will change. You're going to stop supporting that constant version. And when that happens, two things can happen. Either the relationship adapts to your reality, or she starts to disappear. And this leads to an even deeper point, one that few people are prepared to face. If your presence is contingent on the role you play, then to what extent can that be called a real connection? There comes a point when you realize you're not just living a relationship, you're sustaining it. And this perception doesn't come across clearly. It manifests as a strange tiredness. You start to feel like you need to think before you act, measure your words, adjust your behavior, avoid certain reactions, as if any small change could alter how the other person sees you. At first glance, this seems like care. Then, it becomes an effort. And without realizing it, it becomes a pattern. You become someone who needs to maintain a constant emotional state for everything to keep functioning. Always stable, always present, always understanding, always interesting. But nobody can be like that all the time. And that's where the wear and tear begins. Now, imagine a common situation. You're having a tough day. Tired, maybe irritated, maybe just lacking energy. You don't want to talk much. You don't want to entertain anyone. You don't want to hold up any expectations. But you know that if you act this way, something might change. Then you push a little. He answers as he always has. He acts as he always has. He maintains the same posture. And at that moment, you resolve the situation. But it creates a bigger problem, because you reinforce the idea that that standard is who you are, and that increases the anticipation for the next time. Now consider the cumulative effect of that. One day you'll find the strength, in the other one, too. Then, once again, and before you know it, you're no longer being spontaneous. You are performing, and this creates a silent internal conflict. From the outside, everything seems normal. The relationship continues. The connection exists, but inside, something begins to wear down, because there's a difference between being accepted and being accepted only when you conform, and that difference matters. Now comes a direct question. Have you ever felt freer when you were alone than when you were with someone? If the answer is yes, that reveals something important, because healthy relationships shouldn't require less freedom than your own solitude. But when the connection depends on what you give emotionally, freedom diminishes. You start to avoid behaviors, that could damage the image others have of you, and that includes simple things: remain silent. Don't reply right away. Not available. Disagree. Show irritation. All of this starts to seem risky because it can change how you are perceived. And when perception changes, the emotional response changes. And when the emotional response changes, the connection can weaken. This cycle creates a kind of invisible dependency. You don't depend on the person themselves. You depend on the response she gives you when you meet her expectations. And this completely changes the balance of the relationship. Now, there is constant encouragement for you to continue being what works, even if it wears you down. Now let's delve even deeper. There is a psychological phenomenon called intermittent reinforcement. It happens when a reward doesn't always come, but comes in an unpredictable way. And this generates a very high level of attachment. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. You don't always win, but he earns enough to keep trying. Now, bring that into a relationship. When you act in a certain way and receive attention, validation, closeness, that acts as a reward. But this reward is not constant. Sometimes it comes on strong. Sometimes it diminishes. And that makes you try to adjust your behavior even more, trying to regain that level of responsiveness. Without realizing it, you enter a cycle. You observe what works, repeat what works, avoid what doesn't work, and try to maintain what generates a response. But this comes at a cost, because in that process, you start to lose your internal bearings. You stop acting based on what you feel and start acting based on what generates results. And that's dangerous, because at some point, you might look at yourself and realize you no longer know what part is natural and what part is adaptation. Now think about the long term. If a relationship depends on you maintaining a consistent standard of behavior to be valued, is this sustainable? Can you live like this for years? The answer, in most cases, is no. And that's why many relationships break down emotionally, not for lack of feeling, but due to overexertion. A person gets tired of maintaining a version of themselves that they can no longer sustain, and when she stops, the reaction comes. The other person notices the change, and often they don't understand, because, from her point of view, you've simply stopped being the same person you used to be. But in reality, you just stopped adapting at the same level. Now comes an important reflection. What if the reason so many relationships end isn't a lack of love, but is it a lack of sustainable authenticity? Because it's easy to maintain an ideal version at the beginning, but it's impossible to maintain that forever. And when that version starts to fail, the relationship reveals what truly sustains it. If it's just a feeling, she is getting weaker. If it's something deeper, she ups. Now, consider the number of people who stay in relationships where they can't be completely themselves, where they need to adjust their behavior, hide parts of themselves, avoid conflict, just to maintain the connection. This is not uncommon. It's common, and that explains why so many people feel emotionally exhausted even when they are with someone. Because being with someone doesn't mean being comfortable, and being comfortable requires something that many relationships don't offer: space to be real without fear of losing value. Now here is the most important point of all. If you constantly need to prove, adjust, or maintain something in order to be valued, so you're not being chosen, you are being conditioned, and that completely changes how you view the connection itself. Because it's no longer about who likes you, it's about who likes the feeling you deliver. And this leads to an inevitable question, perhaps the most difficult one yet. If you completely stop adapting, who would still remain? There comes a point in life when you stop looking for answers in others and start facing the truth within yourself. And that truth is not comfortable. It doesn't confirm what you'd like to believe. It doesn't protect the ego. It doesn't keep illusions intact. She reveals it. It reveals that many of the connections that seemed deep were based on something unstable. It reveals that some of the affection you received was linked to what you offered emotionally. It reveals that, at various times, you weren't being chosen. You were being useful. And that hurts. It hurts because it shatters a long-held expectation. The expectation of being loved unconditionally simply for existing. But there is another side to that truth, a side that few people are able to see at first. When you understand that many relationships are based on feelings, you also understand that you can stop living trapped by them. You no longer need to maintain a consistent version of yourself to be accepted. You no longer need to adjust every behavior to maintain interest. You no longer need to compromise your authenticity to preserve connection. And this is where the real change begins. But this change doesn't happen simply through understanding. She demands action, and conscious action. If you want to break free from this pattern, you need to apply something simple, yet profoundly difficult. First, observe yourself honestly. Identify which relationships you feel you need to function, where you carefully choose your words, where you avoid being spontaneous, where you feel you need to maintain an image. These are clear signs that you are occupying a role, and until you see that, nothing will change. Second, reduce the need for performance. This doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means stopping supporting what is not natural for you at that moment. If you are tired, allow yourself to be quieter. If you don't want to respond immediately, don't respond. If you disagree, express that clearly. Initially, this may cause discomfort because it breaks the pattern that people were used to. But this discomfort is necessary. It separates those who are connected to their essence from those who were only connected to their function. Third, accept the effect of this. Some people will distance themselves, and that's inevitable, not because you've lost value, but because you stopped supporting the experience they were seeking. And that's not a loss. It's a filter. It is the process that eliminates relationships based solely on emotional convenience, and it opens up space for something more real. Fourth, rebuild your internal frame of reference. Stop measuring your worth by the reactions of others. Start by measuring how well you align with who you truly are. This requires practice, because you have been conditioned for a long time to seek external validation. But little by little, you realize something important. The peace of being authentic is worth more than the approval of conforming. Fifth, learn to recognize real connections. They are not perfect. They are not intense all the time. They don't depend on you always being at your best. They remain even when you're not being emotionally comfortable with them. There is room for silence, for imperfection, for change. And that's rare. But that's exactly why it's worth it. Now, stop for a moment and reflect honestly. How many of your relationships would survive if you simply stopped adapting? How many people would remain close to you if you stopped being exactly what they expect you to be? These answers may be uncomfortable, but they are liberating, because, starting with them, you stop living on autopilot. You start making more conscious choices. You stop investing energy where you need to conform too much, and it begins to value where it can truly exist. Ultimately, it's not about making everyone love you. That was never possible. It's about stopping losing yourself in order to be accepted, and start building relationships where you don't have to disappear to stay. This is the breaking point, and it is also the point of reconstruction. If this content made you reflect, if any part of it resonated with your own experience, then don't dismiss it as just another video. Subscribe to the channel to continue deepening this type of understanding. Like the video so that more people can access this message. And if you'd like, share in the comments even anonymously any experience you've had related to this. Because often, what you've experienced can help another person see something they haven't yet been able to understand.